Okay, great. I'll have you let people in while I'm talking so I don't get too distracted. Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining. This is great to see people from literally all over the world on this screen right now, which is really lovely to see. And I think also a sign of, what the topic is and how relevant it is to so many different places. So I just really am here to welcome you to the event and give a little bit of background. So this is hosted by the Landscape Research Group, of course. And one of the things that we've started doing is having these launches to the special issues that come out in Landscape Research Journal. So we publish 10 issues a year, typically at Landscape Research Journal. Not all of them are special issues, but when the special issues do come together, they're really, really special. And so we've started to do these launch events to be able to bring together the authors in a conversations in a similar way that they are in the journal. That being said, this is the launch event for the journal that was guest edited by Ian Mell, who's on the screen, and we'll be doing most of the coordinating today. And the theme of this issue and therefore event is Rethinking the Green City. That issue was issue 4 of the journal. It's out and available online. I'll put some links in the chat after I wrap up chatting here. So you can definitely check out all of these wonderful authors, and there's others involved as well in that issue. So with that, I think the event will go for about an hour, maybe a little bit longer. And we're really, really happy that you're all here. Is there anything that I missed, Emily? I'm sure there's something.
No, I think you've covered it. Of course, you get free access to the journal and this special issue if you're a member. So if you're not already a member, then join up with LRG. We're a nice bunch.
Lovely bunch.
One question, really, I guess, Zana and Ian, is whether you want people to pop questions into the chat as they go along or wait till the end.
Happy to have you pop them into the chat. We'll be monitoring. There's, a few of us that can be monitoring. So happy to have you pop questions into the chat as they come to you. Ian will be doing an excellent job of kind of coordinating questions and his own questions and discussion. But then we're very happy for you to turn on your camera and unmute and ask a question as well. So feel free to do that, but probably do that towards the end to not interrupt the flow. But if a thought comes, put it in the chat immediately. That won't interrupt anything. Thanks for the question, Brian. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Ian. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Zana. And thank you all for being here. It's really wonderful to be on at least 5 different time zones for this talk, and to have so many people who are interested in ideas around rethinking the green city. Just to give you a little bit of additional context about where this all arrived from, it was really the brainchild of Camilla Santa Anna, who's on the call, is one of the authors of the special issue, who has a big idea about creating a green infrastructure observatory that brings researchers from all over the world. It's a cracking idea. And one of her ideas was to try and get funding from the Newton Fund for a early career researchers networking event, which we put on together at the University of Brasilia, along with one of Camilla's colleagues, so Maria de Carmo. And we brought 19 UK scholars, 19 Brazilian scholars together to really give people an opportunity to explore their own work, but to see whether there were opportunities for working across the UK and Brazil, but also other parts of the world as well. And it's one of those events that the Newton Fund really thought were beneficial to early career researchers who maybe go to a conference and get put in a corner and can't speak as much as they would like to. So we had the event in 2019, and one of the outcomes was a special issue of Landscape Research. And we're lucky enough today to have 4 of the authors with us. So we've got Dr. Paula Barros from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, who is an urban designer and works along with human environmental relationships. We've got Dr. Bertie Dockrell, who I work with at the University of Manchester, who is a planning historian, and we'll be talking about greening a little bit away from what he normally does. We've got Dr. Camilla Santa Anna from now the Federal University of Bahia, formerly of the Federal University of Goiás, who is a landscape architect and does a lot of work on urban greening, green infrastructure, and the way in which people interact with it. and Dr. Helen Hoyle from the University of Sheffield. And Helen is an intersectional researcher working at this sort of nexus of health, place, landscape architecture, and climate. So I think people on the call are really well versed in this complex understanding of place, of design, of nature, of climate, and the fact that we are working in a time where things are potentially getting worse, but we all have ideas about how we can make them get better. And so the special issue of the journal, and indeed the Newton Fund meeting, was aimed to just provide an opportunity for people to share their knowledge and their experiences. And we end up with 5 really interesting papers about a whole host of different things around teaching and the link between design and landscape, around how we might look at favelas and tourism and that commercialization of nature that we see a lot of, around understanding history and how that allows us to see where we're going in the future, and around climate and health as well. So thank you all for being here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to ask each of our 4 speakers to give a brief introduction to who they are and a bit of their work before we go on to some more detailed conversation around the topic of rethinking the green city. So I'd like to start with Bertie. Bertie, if you'd like to just give a bit of a brief overview of your ideas around urban planning and nature or greening, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, and thank you very much, Ian. And it was a pleasure to also be part of the special issue. I suppose, and Ian partly alluded to this, in one sense, I possibly come from a slightly different perspective, in that the paper written by Sam Hayes and myself, I'm a planning historian with a background really in history. And though I think from the point of view of green cities, greening cities, climate change and so on, we obviously face new challenges that worsen every single day, there are also links to the past. And without wishing to say that you can't understand the future without understanding where we've come from, if you look at the confluence of worsening pollution, a worsening economic situation, a problem of funding, a seeming lack of civic engagement, a decline of philanthropy and so on at the moment, and a retrenchment of the state, you could actually argue that not only do those impact, obviously, all aspects of greening cities now, but actually they also did so 150 years ago with the Industrial Revolution and so on. And that therefore the perspective I would come from this on, and Ian asked me to comment on using archives, is to suggest that we don't necessarily need to always reinvent the wheel, but to try and actually take some of the lessons from the past, whether that be bottom-up philanthropy, recognizing that municipalities will promise the earth, particularly at election time, and then deliver very little. So how do we actually get civic buy-in? How did that happen in the 1850s? Why did it happen then? And the 1900s, why does it now? Can we see that green poverty is in fact not a new problem, but one that has gone on for 150 years? How do we get people involved? That if you look at the growing green agenda for municipal parks and then being more user-friendly, they came out of health and pollution concerns 150 years ago, which have direct parallels to today. And perhaps a way forward is not just to try to think of the state doing more, but to go back into those archives and say what worked successfully beforehand and how can we use that again. And apologies for going just slightly over, Ian.
Thank you very much, Bertie. There's a lot of things there that I'm sure we'll come back to. So, Paula, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am an architect and urban design from Brazil. I teach at University Federal of Minas Gerais. And for me, a green city means an inclusive, sustainable, socially rich, multisensory, healthy, and economically productive city. But I want to emphasize that to get it, we need to be able to dismantle the systems of inequality. So it is those who have access to green cities. Everyone should have access to green cities. So this is what a green city means for me, in few words.
Thank you very much, Paula. I think a lot of things that there chime with some of the things that Bertie was mentioning. So I think we'll definitely come back to those notions of inequality and access and who has what and who doesn't have what. Camilla, would you like to go next?
No, thank you, Ian. I would like to thank you for this opportunity. It's such an honor to be at the Landscape Research event. It's a pleasure to be with you and with the audience. I would approach the United States through landscape if I can choose. I understand landscape as a necessity for planning and design climate adapted, inclusive cities. And in this context, having green infrastructure as an important tool for planning and designing greener and more resilient landscape, connecting people, places, and biodiversity. In Brazil, the building high quality and equity GI strategy must consider and act in social and environmental injustice areas in order to promote an anti-racist adaptation to climate change. To do that, another important issue is to integrate community and their ancestrality in the process. How do they tell their own history? Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Camilla. And again, there are some really strong resonant points there. The anti-racist city coming up with the inequality and some of the things that Bertie mentioned as well. So I think this equality theme might be something that runs through the entirety of today. So that's good to notice. So Helen, last but not least.
Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for the introduction previously, Ian, and the opportunity to go to Brasilia, where I met Camilla, my co-author on the paper. For me, I'm currently a lecturer in healthy urban landscapes in the Department of Landscape Architecture at Sheffield University. And I'd say that there are really three key priorities in terms of the green city. We must be thinking about planning, designing and managing cities, green cities, to support human well-being in its fullest sense, physical, mental and social well-being. Also conserving and enhancing biodiversity and prioritising climate resilience. And in terms of achieving that, obviously, it's highly complex. One approach, I mean, overall, we need to think about multifunctionality, and that might mean delivering that within one particular area. So, for example, delivering an urban meadow to prioritise health and biodiversity, or it could be prioritising certain areas for certain, for example, for nature or human well-being.
Nature. I
think it's really important that we work with communities on the ground at the local level. So that is key, and that's the key part of it. And particularly if we're going to address health inequalities, which is all part of that inequality aspect that's been referred to previously. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all four of you there for really setting out some of those key issues that we're looking at around inequality, around access, around understanding what we design versus what we fund versus what we manage, and the potential impact that has on either an individual or communities. So just to pick up on this notion of inequality and the way in which different communities are afforded green space, one might say. Can I just come to Bertie first? Because I know Bertie did some of his PhD research on housing in parts of the East End of Newcastle. And one of the things that I found interesting was the allocation of gardens and the way in which they were seen to be a marker of either being high income or low income. So in terms of looking at the past, Bertie, could you just tell us a little bit about how gardens were perceived by certain councillors in Newcastle and the way in which that might highlight some of the problems that we're currently having with inequality?
Oh, absolutely, and thank you. I mean, I know I'm now going back 120 years, but I think there are direct parallels. But if I said that though there is a movement from the 1870s onwards towards a sort of more private sphere on post-bylaw housing, which for those not UK-based is a movement steadily away from terraces. There's certainly a perception 130 years ago that the sort of undeserving poor shouldn't have access to garden or green space. effectively is nothing more than tools of an economy, happily living, though very different to high density today, nevertheless with a period in high density, poor quality slum housing. For that, might I suggest, inner city tower blocks today, or indeed new UK student builds of 23 stories becoming the slums of tomorrow. And a huge movement in Newcastle, whilst one or two factory philanthropists would say that for the benefit not only of the city but also for the workforce, privatising green space in back gardens of 120 foot would allow the working class and lower middle class at that period to actually lead better, healthier and more productive lives. The counter argument to that was that they wouldn't know how to actually use the space. They weren't to be trusted to access parks such as Salford Park, Peel Park in Salford, one of the earliest nationally, and that any such attachment or access actually needed to be closely monitored and guarded. And it's quite a bizarre thought to think, if we go back 100 years ago, to councils and early council housing inspecting gardens and actually telling people whether or not they were doing a good enough job, with almost a threat of you'll do it properly or you'll lose it. I'm not suggesting that's quite there today, but you could argue that there are parallels from the point of view of what sort of housing does the state decide that those who can't afford to provide for themselves deserve. And I don't like using the words undeserving poor, deserving poor. They feel historic and out of place. But I do think we get an increasing political narrative of that amongst councils in the UK now. And you can also see it from the point of view that the grand municipal parks for greening might well still be supported today, but those in poorer neighbourhoods tend to have less maintenance to them. They tend to be closed for longer. They tend to be gated at night. And that is once again curtailing access of those who perhaps need it most and don't have the financial resources to get into green belt or further away in a way that is not dissimilar to 100 years ago. Sorry for the long answer, Ian.
No, thank you, Bertie. And I think, again, I'm going to come to Paola and Camilla in a little bit to get a Brazilian perspective on this. But I think a lot of that notion of public versus private and what people are allowed to access and what they know about and what they perceive to be part of their environment. I think because Camilla mentioned being anti-racist, I'd like to just come to her before going to Paola. And Helen, I saw your hand, so don't worry. Could you just tell us a little bit about the Brazilian experience about public parks and public spaces and what makes them either inclusive or perceived to be maybe racist, for want of a better word?
Yeah, we try. In fact, in Brazil, we have the problem that to rethink the green cities through landscape, having green infrastructure as a tool, we must rethink the way that we are facing the challenge of plan and design the informal settlements. How we can rethink nature in these places and promote or revise the environmental injustice and try to reduce with parks and promoting gardens the social inequality. What happened in Brazil is that always as people need a house, the green spaces are always segregate to the last economic funding. So we figured out that people, all the urban operation, focus on promoting nature when people having a home. However, to rethink the city in a holistic strategy to promoting climate adaptive strategy and reverse the racism, we must rethink this area if we have the environmental injustice to promote nature, but not only nature. We must revise the thing that we have the the majority of Black people living in this area, they are segregated. So we must empower that and promote green jobs and try to think like now we are discussing about nature-based solution. But in the case of Brazil, we must consider how to promote nature-based solutions for informal assessments, that we have a really places with people that are excluded for the society, how we can empower these people and promote nature-based solutions that give them opportunity as a job and give them the opportunity to rethink their biome. Because we have nature-based solutions, but we need to rethink about nature-based solution in our context, the Brazilian context, that is different from Goiás, where I teach before, and from Bahia, for example, that I teach now, that is Mata Atlântica with Caatinga, and in Goiás we have the Bioma Cerrado. So how we can promote these nature-based solutions, engaging in this nature that is place-based, but also we engage the community and their ancestrality, and we reverse the colonialist urbanism that impose this racial settlement, how we can say here. I think it's this here. I'm a little bit nervous, I don't know why.
Thank you for the really key points there. And just to pick up on one and to ask Paul to talk a little bit about architecture and urban design, when you're talking through about empowering communities and providing them with the knowledge and the skills to be able to shape their own places. And I particularly like your students for society sort of quote there, that potentially we are creating graduates who should be going out and making society better. So Paula, in terms of maybe the teaching of either urban design or architecture or landscape, how would you consider trying to empower either your students to be a social good, or how do you work with communities to try and ensure that these ideas can be brought into their everyday thinking and therefore they can try and help their local communities?
There are some years now that I have worked with the students in the favelas in Belo Horizonte. Before the COVID, we were working with a really small favela where you had the opportunity to learn a lot with people who used to live there, mostly children. But this favela would occupy an area smaller than a block, really small. And as there were other lecturers working with this community, we attempted to create some social ties with a larger community called Morro do Papagaio. So during all year, we develop works mostly with children from Morro do Papagaio. And what I could see there is that they have a lot of local knowledge. They have amazing solutions that are going on, like urban agriculture and others. Children value a lot the green elements that they can have, that they can interact. Thinking from urban design, thinking as an urban designer and as a lecturer, what I think is that we need to support what is already going on there. We need to come together with them, because I don't think that they need us. We need each other. So it's about bringing different knowledges, different expertise, and support what is going on already. Because they are really very creative, not only children, but the community as a whole. So this, I think, may be a way around the problem that is very complex, as Camila told.
And I think you've really hit on a key idea here, Paula, about sort of co-design and exchange of knowledge. And this is where I think Helen could have some really useful insights from your work in the UK. Could you just talk us through how you've been trying to engage schools or other community members in these more climate resilient approaches, and what sort of successes or barriers that you've seen so far.
Okay, yeah, so I was going to talk a little bit about that, using a positive example as a kind of riposte to Bertie, in terms of I've been working in Luton in Bedfordshire, and Luton, as I was talking with some of the people on the ground yesterday, gets a lot of bad press. But Luton is one of the places that has a lot of deprivation and yet has some very positive diversity, where people, you know, in recognised surveys have been shown to different ethnic groups get on very positively together. And, you know, Wardown Park in Luton is a former Edwardian park. And if you walk around there on a Saturday, as I did this Saturday, doing some research with the people, and yesterday, you see a huge array of people dancing in the bandstand, multi-faith parties, sessions, sports going on, all sorts of activities. And I think the way I've engaged there is I've been engaging with the land managers and also public health professionals, and I think it's very much about partnership working and getting in there at the ground level, and partly through schools. And so, I mean, I have been working with the local primary school across from the park, Riverbank Primary School. We've been working on a small engagement and research project called Future Proofing Luton. The Landscape Art Institute were involved, and they actually gave us some trees as a carbon offset, which we planted with local children. And every year I'm going back there doing workshops with the school children. We've had incremental funding coming on from different sources. And now my research is feeding into the park's heritage lottery bid to get more funding to improve the quality of the lake within the park. So we really are working together, and through a recent project I'm working on, I also get involved more with public health professionals, and that's the sort of real link, sort of bringing in people and trying to address these health inequalities. One fantastic group, and I'll just give you this example and then I'll stop talking is Penrose Routes to Recovery, and I met 15 fantastic members of that group who come together, do different gardening activities, and those people are people with complex emotional needs, but they are, you know, really making a big difference, and they're all actually making a difference physically to the quality of the park through what they're doing. So that's a positive example. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks for that, Helen. And I think this feeds into a point that Paolo was making about having these social ties to place. And I'd like just to ask Bertie to comment a little bit about Peel Park in Salford, actually, because that's one of those, seems to be a classic example of how the community, the philanthropic community and the city of Salford, that probably was Manchester at that point, came together to all recognise the value of Peel Park. So from your work, Bertie, you just talk us through some of the ways in which those different communities work together in sort of a similar positive way to what Helen's talking about.
Yeah, I was actually going to use a different example, if I might, slightly in, but I can use the Salford one, and it also ties into Tim's question on the chat, actually, because I think he's absolutely right that though there are individual examples, there's now massive underfunding for regular maintenance that is a problem. What happened with Salford, and to a lesser extent Newcastle after Lees Park and others were gifted to the city, is that you had bottom-up voluntary organisations, not by any means third sector at that stage, doing far more maintenance, but you actually had fundraising from working class in Salford who contributed somewhere in the region of 70% of the cost of the park, which sounds like an unprecedented sum these days. I suppose in one sense that's almost been taken over by lottery funding. But what it did clearly show, by trying to show parks, which they still should be, but frequently aren't if you take out all the resources, is to be a different resource for different generations, and arguably to offer different things, whether that's middle and upper class promenading in the 19th century, or whether it's actually the only place where you can go to a free gym in the 19th century. When we consider now the number of kids' parks within parks that are ripped out in this country, it's extraordinary to think that the sort of mandate for civic parks 100 years ago not only had play areas, but deliberate areas for children's education in botany and so on, in an attempt to engage different sectors of society and people on different planes. And I think that's part of something that we've missed. I'm happy to come back more on funding on that and possible way forwards. But you see a similar approach in Newcastle, and I would argue that actually a city that is bucking the trend at the moment, though not with its large civic parts, but at a smaller neighbourhood scale, would be Liverpool, where there are some interesting parallels of actually community and neighbourhood level engagement, maintenance, restoration of parks, or smaller green areas, to be more precise, sports, which can be seen to have direct parallels to what did happen, what we have somehow lost along the way, and which government is then quite happy to cut funding for.
Okay, thank you, Bertie. And I just want to ask Camilla a quick question about this, because Camilla did her PhD in Brasilia, so a planned city, very much the super block city, with every block having a set of public and civic infrastructure. So in terms of that delivery of multifunctional spaces which provide activities and amenities for the whole cross section of society, could you just give us your thoughts on whether you think the planned and managed nature of Brasilia in terms of its green space actually delivered the things that what we're talking about?
Actually, Brasilia, we have a big challenge. It's true that it's a planned city, but it's also a city that segregates a lot. Ian knows that, Helen also, and Paula, because it's really expensive to live in pilot plan of Brasilia. It was a city plan for build, how can I say, a bucolic scale, as mentioned Lúcio Costa, that was the planner. But this bucolic scale, that must be the landscape scale or the nature scale, the scale of the greening city, bring it to us big blocks of nature that is really hard to be appropriated, because you have a huge area of grass, but this huge area of grass doesn't guarantee that you have the same quality of biodiversity and you have a multifunctional space. They are trying now to reverse this situation, this scenario, promoting, it's really at the beginning. The first thing is promoting the naturalist gardens. So you have like in the part north of the Brazilian plant palette, you have some experience that they are planting forestry and trying to promote naturalist gardens. And in the same movement, you have also Jardim Sequeiro at University of Brasilia. That is an amazing opportunity to see how we can implementing a naturalist garden in the Carrefours around point and at the university, because you have huge gardens of building by seeds, and you have also the opportunity to plan with nature. But they also are rethinking this area, trying to rethink promoting green, considering water, so sensitive places from water, because Brasilia has a huge problem with inundations. So the green areas also are trying to be monofunctional in sense of promoted drainage, and rethink the way that we regulate water in the city, because we have a plan that impose the urban design to the territory without considering the territory and its biodiversity. So mainly Brasilia was constructed with ornamental plants, not with cerrado plants. So now they are trying to reverse this and promote nature, considering the biome. This is really an important thing, I think.
Okay, thank you, Camilla. Helen, did you want to come in on this?
No, I'm not too. I won't say anything at this point. Okay.
Okay. Well, I think Camilla raises a really important point there, because we're talking about appropriateness and the selection of what works in different places. And I think this is part of the benefit of these kind of conversations, that we're talking about different climatic zones, we're talking about different scale and density, and even within Brazil. I mean, Camilla now lives in Bahia. She used to live in Goiás, which is a very, 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 very small town in the middle of the state of Goiás. And it's basically the countryside, and it's lovely, but it's very definitely not Brasilia. And so there's what's going to work in one place isn't going to work in somewhere else. So Paolo, just come to you for a second. Given again, come back to, let's say, an architectural and urban design sort of perspective, are there any particular types of greening interventions that you think work more effectively in your experience than others? Be it street trees or sustainable drainage or new parks or green roofs. What would work in Brazil better than, say, other places?
It's a difficult question here, because Brazil is very diverse. But I may say, because when you talk about green spaces, we have to talk about maintenance as well. So if you look the cities as made of micro, meso, and macro scale elements, and made of fixed elements that change at different paces, we can see how dynamic is the city in its different scales. So I would say that maybe, again, the local scale, gradual small changes by local people attending the local needs and wants, it is more likely to be well-maintained, well-used. But of course, the top-down is also needed, because the city is too complex. So a kind of maybe sandwich model where everyone comes together, like in Brazil now. I have had the opportunity as Helen to work in the favelas with other lecturers from arts and also from the public health. And it's amazing how we can learn from each other, from the local community, from children, and from these other experts. So I don't have one answer, but I would guess about the importance of the gradual small changes.
Okay, thank you, Helen.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, thank you, Paula. I think it is so contextual. I think the specific interventions that work. I mean, are we talking about addressing, are the most acute challenges ecological, or are they health inequalities, or are they all happening at once? And then in terms of what you can actually do physically, depending on the soil, the climate, are you choosing the right species even when you put stuff in? And then what do people actually want? Even if you think, oh, health inequalities are the major challenge, but then the local population wants something else, and then you've got political context as well as cultural context. And political will is huge. I think it's no accident that Luton has a swathe of Labour councillors, and there's only 3 Tory councillors across the whole of Luton, and that's an anomaly in the southeast and east of England. And that's maybe why these areas are prioritised. So that's another factor.
Okay, thank you. And I think that understanding of context, I mean, it's like when we talk to our students, it's like, it depends is the answer, and it's contextual. That's the answer to every question ever. But I think that notion of gradual change and understanding local political context and the way in which that shapes very directly development or what doesn't get developed. So Bertie, just to come to you on this, given your broader planning hat, are there any things that you would see from your archival work where you've seen very clear, strong political leadership compared to maybe what we might call the wishy-washy leadership that we currently have?
It's interesting coming directly back to Helen on that one. Liverpool, which of course those who are UK based will know, is a Labour solid, probably the most solid Labour city in the country, and has been for 50 years. Its entire green movement in the 19th century was Tory dominated. So was the entire health reform at the time. With at that stage, rather than, dare I say, career politicians and slippery little buggers that we get today, I'm sure many of them were just as slippery, and I did choose the words going, Helen, I'll come back in just a sec. You get the philanthropy and actually local wealth taking a leadership for their communities, almost in a way that the Lib Dems do in the UK more now. And whether that shows that Toryism post-Thatcher or with Thatcher lost its way and actually became Gladstonian liberalism. Sorry for a very UK-based answer on that. But it is interesting how we do seem to go through swathes of different political agenda on it. And I agree with Helen on Luton and the Labour agenda. You can see it in Newcastle, although actually there at the moment there have been movements against community take-up of parks. But how we get that leadership side back when there tends to be a sort of right of centre, certainly in the UK, if we can get away with cutting a public service locally, we might, and a green area is something that is easy to do because people don't notice it until it's gone, which I think is shocking in a way that may not have happened in the past. Sorry, Helen, I know you were just coming.
No. I'm sorry for gesticulating so wildly and being so. I would agree that it's a sort of historico-politico in that, you know, that my father was a Tory. He was a paternalistic industrialist in the Northwest. You know, that was the view. It was a kind of we'll look after the workers. You know, but now that's not the way the Tories. You know, the face, is it? So
I mean,
and I think we would often rely, like in any situation with green space, it's about the it's like mayors in South America, or it's about the individual who drives it. I know, you know, an individual, Jane Conway, who's the operations manager in Luton, who, you know, cares passionately about this stuff, and that's why it's happening, and knows a lot of people and communicates. And I think often it's those individuals, these charismatic, strong leaders individually at different levels. It's just a pity we don't have them up there. That's the problem.
And to come back to that one very, very quickly, but the changing nature of philanthropy from being perhaps locally based to that far richer billionaire style that wants to leave not a quiet legacy any longer, but one that is perhaps as much an edifice or almost phallic symbol of their own male strength occasionally than the quiet side of Ian is shaking his head, sorry, than perhaps the quieter community-based things that you might have had many years ago. And before Macaulay comes in, of course, to discussions of the feminist city, which we had at the Planning Research Conference last week.
Thank you both for that. I think it's interesting that there are these ongoing changes that we're seeing in the UK around who and what. And I'm going to come to you in a second, Camilla, about the politics of environment in Brazil. But just before we do, I think this notion of strong leadership is really key because at the moment I'm in China, I'm based in Hong Kong at the moment, and there's very clear leadership in China around environment, particularly around water management. So there's Fund Cities programs, and they have a running set of 5-year changes on eco cities, low carbon cities, low waste cities. Every 5 years there's a new one. But you look at somewhere like Singapore, where since they gained independence from the British, they've had successive and successful tree policies, water management policies, environmental policies, energy policies, partly based around it being a nation state, so it has to do something, and partly because the environment is such a big issue. And I think the soft authoritarianism that you might call Singapore as being, I think is really an interesting model where everyone buys into it because everyone sees the collective good. And I think that's relatively unique around the world. And just to come to Camilla now, I mean, Brazil's gone through quite a tumultuous last few years. And have you seen any changes since the last election in terms of the environment and climate being brought back into political discourse, or is it still sort of down below where it was for the last few years?
It's a really hard question, but I will try to answer. I think from where we are much better. This is true, and we are. I think. I hope I found the good words to explain what I want to. I think that we progress a lot now with these new elections and everything that's going on in Brazil. That is, we have the women's and ministry, we have space for the indigenous community, and we have a lot of progress that we were before, that was really hard. But I think it's still, we have to fight a lot to guarantee the right to the environment, because in Brazil we have the fact that we are a really important hotspot, global hotspot. With Amazon, with Mata Atlântica, we have a biodiversity, important biodiversity, but also we are destroying our biodiversity. So we must fight against the capital interest, and we are fighting for guarantee the ancestrality community. So at the same way that we saw in your papers, Ailton Krenak, that is an indigenous leader, having his voice. We have Shai going to Harvard and saying things that they are indigenous important leaders. These leaders and the opportunity of them of speaking doesn't guarantee that the greening and the environment is considering as a green agenda important to the growth of Brazil. So we are, for example, fighting against marco temporal, that is a law that wants to wants to legitimate that we must consider the history of Brazil after the Constitution of 88, that disconsider all the indigenous history in the relation that they have with the territory. This is just to mention the fights that we must have every day, even at university, that we are trying to guarantee the right to landscape. For example, yesterday I went with the students to a park here in Salvador. It's Parque do Pituaçu. It's an important park with a huge biodiversity. That was all the territory of the park, as didn't have a policy. In fact, there is a policy, but the policy didn't guarantee the land use. So the park are must be invaded by housing, rich housing actually, because they don't want to use the park, but they want to live behind the park. They can open the window and see the park. Now, this is the case of Brazil. And in this park, we have huge problems because it's an environmental park. It's a hot spot of the biodiversity in Salvador, but we don't have the guarantee of the maintenance, how we can maintain this place and how we can guarantee that the community can use this place. So this is some of the problems that we are having in Brazil.
Thank you, Camilla. Paolo, is there anything that you'd like to add to that before we move on to some of the questions in the chat?
I only would like to emphasize that, yes, we have a lot of environmental problems as the world, as several other countries as well. But in our case, I think we really need to dismantle the systems of inequality in order to be able to get the green city for all.
Okay, thank you, Paula. And I think a lot of what we're talking about has been discussed in the comments in the chat as well. So I think Tim's point about maintenance and knowledge of local authorities, I think we'll come back to that one in a second. But one of the other ones that's popped up here is around who is this nature for, what types of nature works in what places. And can we actually do the right thing? Do we know what the right thing is in a place? So we've got people here from the UK, from Brazil, from around the world. Would anyone like to say what the right kind of green city might look like, just in terms of this equitable, anti-racist, inclusive, and functional city? So just a small question for you all to think about. Anyone like to go first? Helen.
As you said, it all depends. It's contextual. I mean, I would always start from where the challenges are, and which is where I started. It's about climate resilience, or it won't survive. The nature crisis. We've got to think about biodiversity loss, so we've got to conserve and enhance it, and look at mental and physical well-being. So we've got those things to juggle and prioritize. So the challenge is how to do that whilst dealing with the inequity and inequalities, and that's a challenge. But you can't say there's any sort of one size fits all. I think there are approaches to planning, so the strategic approach at the higher level maybe, and then as Paula was saying, at the grassroots, and this is what I believe, working at the local scale to deliver what is most meaningful and appropriate to the people living in a particular area, those communities. But obviously we have to choose vegetation that's going to work in a climate, and we have to future-proof. We have to think towards future climates. We can't keep planting what was there because it was there. It won't survive in another 50 years if climates are changing. We have to think about flooding if that's the challenge. We need to think about aridity, increasing desertification, all of these challenges. So we have to be very contextual and responsive to the specific context.
Yeah. Can I pose two questions, Ian?
Ian, you are muted. We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me, Ian?
Yeah, we'll just let Paula answer the question first, Garth, then we'll come to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, fine.
Paula.
Okay, looking for the situation as an urban designer, and considering that a green city, reading a green city as a place-shaping continuum, I think it's very important the trials and errors may be an interesting approach. So what I mean is that we should not fear fail, since it is in a small scale. I think it's about one way around, maybe about trying evidence-based, small-scale interventions that are collaborative, that are caring, and facing it as a continuum. So let's learn together and grow together, maybe a way around.
Okay, thank you, Paula. Gareth, you had a question.
Okay, I've just posed the questions. Should we believe that people have a human right to green space in cities? And if so, how do we secure this? I'm thinking historically at what Bertie was saying regarding the planning history of all this in the United Kingdom. Of course, most of this was not very philanthropic from the outset. And of course, if you think even as far, think back to 1997, the Labour Party put in its manifesto that people in England and Wales, in the United Kingdom, England and Wales should have a right to roam, a right of access to open country. I was in Wales responsible for leading the team who secured that. Now we've got a quarter of Wales, which allows people to walk freely. But of course, in an urban situation, the circumstances can be quite different. One of the things I noticed that Imen Zafran is one of the participants, and I know Imen's got a very big interest in parks in Tunis, and I'm familiar with some of those, one of them, the biggest one of those. And if you talk to Tunisians, for example, they sometimes reject the park because it was planted on them during colonial times. So this issue about, okay, if they have a right of green space, what sort of space should it be? How is it designed? And is it, as long as it's green and extensive, is that sufficient?
Thank you for that, Gareth. I mean, very thought-provoking question. I'm going to link it to a specific question from one of our participants, so Elgar Kamju, who works at UCD with Mark Scott, who's actually has a question for Paula, and it's, have you ever encountered any ownership issues increasing inequalities relating to green space? And I think it ties to Gareth's question there about should we give people the right to green space, and if so, how do we do it? So any thoughts on that, Paula?
I think yes, green is a right, and what I think is that maybe we could think that green should offer functional opportunities for all, should also. So I think that maybe three aspects: functional opportunities to do different activities. It also should allow social interactions, and finally positive emotional reactions as well. So it's everything interconnected, what you do, with whom, and how you feel about that. And so, yes, it's a right, because as Helen had mentioned several times, it affects our physical, our cognitive, our mental, and our social health and well-being. About how to do it is, I think that may be through trial and error in a small scale with different expertise, with the local community, and as we it would create, it would start from the micro, but you cannot forget the other scale, the meso and the macro. It's crazy because it is about bringing everything together, but I think that the key structure maybe would be from the context, from the local. A difficult question. Ian, I don't know if I answered the question. Is it?
It's always nice to ask the difficult question rather than answer them. But just building on that, and Gareth's question again, there's a question in the chat about built environments and high density and the way in which we might think about greening there. And it was aimed at me because I'm in Wuhan, it's a very high density city. And I think, again, it comes back to this notion of it depends, and it's contextual, that if you walk around Hong Kong, most neighborhoods have a small parklet with exercise equipment, which all the older generation use to do their daily exercises, and they go and they sit there and they gossip, and there's a really strong social function. So a lot of what we've been talking about, they also have those larger, more prestige parks, which have a lot of different amenities. So the things that you've just been speaking about, Paula. And so I think density doesn't necessarily mean we have to have poorer or less functional greening. I think we just need to be more thoughtful about what we're planning, what we're designing, what it means today, and what it might mean 5-10 years down the line. Because I think from a UK perspective, a lot of those places that maybe aren't as successful, they might have been poorly designed or particularly poorly managed, where they just haven't had the funding to maintain the quality, and then people stop going towards using them. And I think then you get into that vicious circle of, if people don't think it's nice, they don't think it's for them, they don't go to it, they don't go outside, and you get into some of those cycles of a lack of use. So I think a lot of what these conversations are about what can we do in a particular location, what works, what doesn't work, what local knowledge do people have that we can work with, and how can they lead the process rather than being led by experts. And then there's the whole role about the municipality and funding, and then ethical questions around whether people should or shouldn't have access to nature. So I think there's a lot of things that have come up today that are really intriguing in terms of the ways in which we think differently about what a green city might look like, but also complementing each other with different ideas from different locations and from different disciplinary backgrounds as well. And personally, I think that's both a challenge, and it's amazingly fun to be involved in these things, because every day, to use a really, really bad phrase, I'm going to roll my own eyes, it's a school day. We're always learning, and just being here, it's like you learn so much about what is culturally viable versus what's not. So I think because we're just about out of time, so I think wrapping up, I think there isn't a simple solution. It is all contextual, and it does all depend on where we are. And I think Gareth's question in particular, asking the big moral questions, has to be part of this conversation, because personally I would say green space should be for everybody. But then it comes back to Tim's question about, well, how are we going to pay for it? And some of the other questions around gentrification versus universal access are all part of these conversations around what makes a city inclusive or anti-racist or equitable, and what makes it a place that you would want to live in. And do you make that choice? So we have somebody in the chat who's from Turkey saying, well, actually a lot of these places are in the periphery and they're near where poor people live. Or are these things thrust upon you because you live in a certain area? And again, I know Elgar's work in Tehran is a lot about those ownership issues. So I think there's a lot of scope here for debate. I don't think any of us have the answer, but I think between us, we have a lot of the parts of the answer and parts of the solution, and actually having special issues of journals, having conversations that actually real people who are not academics can be part of, and actually talking to people on the ground, particularly from what you've been talking about, Paula and Helen, I think is really key, because as Bertie says, we can look at the past and see what we did right and what we did wrong, and we can look at what we're doing now and appreciate who we're doing it for. Are we doing it for the right reasons? Are we all evil politicians trying to do things for us, or are we actually thinking about society? And so I think there's an awful lot of scope to continue this conversation. I think it will continue forever, because we're never going to get it right, but at least we can try and get it right. And as Paula said, to finish on this, if we're scared to fail, we won't do anything. Doing something, failing, and learning from that mistake, I think, is key. And I think if we're going to make cities greener, more sustainable and inclusive, we have to know where we made a mess of it and do it differently next time. So I'd like to thank Paula, Bertie, Camilla, and Helen for their really insightful thoughts. Thank you all for the questions and for attending. Thank you to the LRG for hosting this, and for Landscape Research for providing the space to do the special issue. And I'll hand back to Zaina for any final remarks.
I'm going to pass it right over to Emily, actually, to wrap up. But thank you so much. Before I do that, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for coming. But I think Emily has a couple of final words.
Well, I want to reiterate Ian's thanks to all the participants. That was wonderful, and everybody for their questions and coming along. I see a lot of familiar names there as well, and a lot of new ones. So do consider becoming a member of LRG. That, as people say, is a great session. And we do actually, I mean, we're talking about the theory here, and now we have a practical event coming up of a field trip of a post-industrial city of Dunkirk in France. So do message me if you're interested in that, because that hooks up very nicely with what we've been talking about today. Okay, so yes, thanks. So just to say thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.